Overwatch is a super fun team-based shooter. There is a lot of information in Overwatch, which can be really overwhelming for new players. The game just drops into the thick of things, leaving you to feel around in the dark. On top of this, most educational Overwatch content is garbage on YouTube, full of clickbait, half-truths, and outright lies. This makes it difficult for learning players to know what advice is trash and what advice is beneficial, especially when views do not correlate at all to quality. Therefore, in this video, I want to teach not only the basic fundamentals, how they come together to make the game the way it is, and some practical applications, but also lay a path for you to go beyond this video and become an even better, more understanding player. I just want to zoom out and look at the big picture. What is Overwatch really about? How does everything fit together in the grand scheme of things? How can I apply the core principles to my game? To reiterate, I'm here to give you a broad understanding of the game, not little tips and tricks. Before we start, for every concept that I go over, there will be additional resources in the description that teach the same concept either more in depth or in a different way. So, if there's anything you do not understand or want to learn more about, check the description. To begin, let's look at the core components of the game, starting with the heroes. A hero is simply a character model with a gun and a couple of abilities. From a fighting game perspective, each hero has a unique moveset, a special set of tools that allows them to achieve their purpose in the game, which we will go over later. There are 32 heroes, meaning there are 32 movesets available to choose from. This is different from a game like Apex, where you can customize your kit to a certain degree. A hero's moveset is commonly called their resources. The main overarching goal of Overwatch is to win the objective. Resources are the means by which the player achieves this goal. They are a set of tools to win the objective. Each team has 6 heroes. Alternatively, you could say a team has 6 different sets of tools to achieve their goal of winning the objective together. These resources interact with the map or other heroes in a vast number of ways, but everything is done with the intention of ultimately winning the objective.
Victory!
Let's look at this through the lens of chess for a moment. Each team has 6 pieces, each with a different way of moving and attacking. Additionally, each piece has a health bar, so pieces are capable of surviving attacks, unlike in chess. Also, there's not one mastermind controlling each team, each piece has its own mastermind. The masterminds on each team can choose to communicate and work together, or they can choose not to. However, this is not even the most chaotic element of the game. Unlike chess, where each player takes turns moving pieces and the games can span 5 minutes or 100 years, Overwatch includes a temporal element, which adds the variables speed, cooldowns, ultimate charge times, weapon travel time, etc. On top of this, the chessboard is not a 2-dimensional area, but a 3-dimensional space. From this example, we can identify the core components of the game: resources, space, communication, and time. However, we will not be going over communication in depth in this video, so ignore that. Frequently, you will hear from top-level players and coaches that Overwatch is all about space and time. However, a more accurate thesis statement would be the following: Overwatch is a game about using resources to take or control space and angles at the right time in order to win the objective. Nothing more and nothing less. Notice that I added a couple of words there, like taking and controlling and angles. Don't worry, you will deeply understand this thesis and everything that relates to it by the end of this video. First, let's talk about space, the least chaotic element of the game and the foundation upon which the actual game plays out. What is space? Imagine a 3-dimensional box. This box is space. Now, put a stickman in there. This stickman is controlling this space. Let's put another stickman in here. This stickman is contesting this space. Now, the stickman took this space and is now controlling it. That is space. However, this space is boring. There we go. Now there is something obstructing this space. This obstruction is called cover. Because of this obstruction, there are now 6 different spaces within this box. Now, let's create a set of stairs to get on top of this wall. Now, this wall is both cover and a high ground. Now, if we add a bunch of stairs and stitch different pieces of cover together, we have a map. As you can see, a map is just one big space divided by a bunch of pieces of cover into several smaller spaces. Now, let's talk about angles. Angles are called many different things in the community, such as sightlines or LOS. Angles are simply the relationships between different spaces. If you can draw an unobstructed line between 2 different areas on the map, this is an angle. In Overwatch, there are millions of angles on each map, aka millions of relations between millions of different spaces on the map. Although so many spaces and angles exist, Not all are created equal. Some spaces and angles are more valuable than others, such as high ground. By more valuable, I mean positions that give an advantage to the user of said position. These advantages can come in the form of health packs, high ground, cover, rotational options, and more, which we will go over more in depth in part 7. Maps are generally designed to give defenders these sorts of positional advantages on top of others to keep the game fun and fair. Think about it. If the attackers get to attack the same objective multiple times and only need to succeed once to win, then it makes perfect sense that the defenders need to have some sort of advantage. Speaking of attackers and defenders, in Overwatch there are two teams, attackers and defenders. These two teams compete in order to complete an objective. These objectives ask the attackers to take a specific area, or space, from the defenders and control it, while, at the same time, asking the defenders to prevent the attackers from taking or controlling that space. So the overall goal of Overwatch is to take or control space. But how do we do that? In order to take or control space, the game gives each team resources divided among 6 teammates. These resources are everything from abilities, ultimates, weapons, health, movement, and more. Basically, anything about a hero that a player has control over is a resource. Most resources in the game are unique, making Overwatch very interesting. Unlike in some games where every player gets to manipulate every aspect of his kit, their set of resources, the game instead gives 32 options for every player to choose from. These 32 options are divided into 3 categories: tank, damage, and support. Damage, or DPS, have resources that specialize in creating pressure. Pressure is the forcing of the other team to use resources. This pressure is usually the result of dealing damage or threatening to deal damage, hence the name damage. Think of Tracer shooting a healer, which forces them to use resources to heal themselves. Or think of Bastion shooting a Reinhardt, which forces him to put up his shield, which is a resource. Tanks have resources that specialize in denying, nullifying, or absorbing the other team's resources. Another way to put it is that tanks specialize in relieving pressure. Think of Reinhardt's shield, which nullifies damage and abilities, or Roadhog's hook, which denies movement. Tanks' large health pools allow them to absorb burst damage, hence the name tank. Supports have resources that specialize in strengthening their own team's resources and weakening the other team's resources. Think of Mercy's damage boost beam, which grants the target 30% increased damage output, or of Lucio's speed, which boosts his team's movement resource. Or even think of healing in general, which limits the effectiveness of the enemy's weapons and abilities. Just because a role specializes in something, it neither means that that thing is only what they can do, nor that no one else can do that thing. For example, tanks can create pressure, DPS can deny resources, and Baptiste can do literally anything. Each team is divided evenly into these 3 categories: 2 tanks, 2 DPS, and 2 supports. So now you know what resources are. If a team has no resources, they literally cannot take or control space. But how do players use resources to take or control space, and what does taking and controlling space even mean? You will learn what this means over the next couple of parts. Let's begin by talking about 3 kinds of space: hostile space, free space, and safe space are where resources and space come together. Hostile space is an area on the map that is being pressured. Remember that I said earlier that pressure is the forcing of the other team to use resources. A more specific definition is that pressure is the use of resources to force or bait the other team into using resources. If a character continues to be pressured, aka stands in hostile space, they will eventually run out of their health resource and die. This is why the space is called hostile. The easiest way to exert pressure is through using resources that deal damage, which is why damage characters are said to specialize in creating pressure, or in creating hostile space. Secondly, free space is an area on the map that is not being pressured. Players are free to occupy this space without using resources. Safe space is what appears when hostile space is converted to free space via resources. In other words, it is the result of relieving pressure off of space through the use of resources. This process is called creating space, which you can think of as being short for creating safe space. Recall that tanks specialize in denying, nullifying, and absorbing resources, especially damage-dealing resources. Thus, tanks specialize in creating safe space, or creating space. However, I would also like to note that another way to relieve pressure off of space is to simply eliminate the source of the pressure. For example, if a Mercy is standing in hostile space, her Reinhardt can put up his shield and deny the resources that are applying the pressure. This converts the space behind the shield from hostile space into safe space. Mercy is now standing in safe space. This Reinhardt just created space by relieving the pressure applied by the soldier. However, the area will turn back to hostile space the instant the Reinhardt lowers his shield. Keep this in mind. I want you to notice something about hostile space. When pressure is being applied to space and making it hostile, resources are being used at an angle. Without resources, pressure cannot be applied, and without an angle, hostile space cannot be created. Remember that an angle is simply the unobstructed relationship between two spaces. Thus, to use a resource on an angle, a character needs to stand in one of the two spaces to be able to apply the pressure to the other space. This is the same for some other resources that don't necessarily create hostile space, such as healing resources. Applying this generally, it is evident that players need to have access to space, whether free, safe, or hostile, in order to utilize resources on the angles that branch off of that space. Because hostile space requires an angle to exist, natural cover becomes immensely important. Cover cuts through the infinite angles on a map and limits the options that players can use to create pressure. Theoretically, in a completely coverless map, Widowmaker, who has near infinite range and insane damage capabilities, will simply create infinite hostile space and completely dominate. Additionally, this shows that sometimes safe space doesn't need to be created to relieve pressure. Going back to the Mercy example, if the Mercy simply walked behind cover, she would no longer have been pressured by the soldier, and Reinhardt could have saved this shield resource for a more pressing threat. It is important to understand the difference between free space and safe space. Resources are necessary to utilize safe space, but resources are not necessary to utilize free space. In the same way, health resources are necessary to utilize hostile space, while the other two kinds do not. Whichever team can utilize more angles will have more options to exert pressure, and the enemy will have fewer options to escape this pressure. This is why creating space is so important. The more safe space that is created, the more room a team will have to do things, and the more angles they will be able to access without sacrificing health resources. It is very easy to create space. All Reinhardt has to do is hold up his shield, and now there's a bunch of space for his team to utilize. However, maintaining this created space is difficult. Keeping this space as safe as possible is the responsibility of tanks. This maintenance of space is called controlling space. However, teams only have so many resources, which means they can only create and control so much space. Thus, they must prioritize creating and controlling space that matters. The most important space on the map is the objective, so obviously both teams ultimately want to control the objective. However, objectives are a tiny portion of a map as a whole, which means there must be a reason to create and control space in places other than the objective. But how, why, where, and when? This is one big question you will learn to answer over the rest of the video. One major factor to consider is what types of characters are on your team. Here we will discuss the different individual character types and team compositions, as well as how resources synergize on the team level. The 32 different characters can be divided into 4 categories: close range and mobile, close range and immobile, long range and mobile, and long range and immobile. Although there is most definitely a spectrum, every character is generally designed to function within one of these categories. Close range simply means characters who have resources that are most effective when used on short angles. Likewise, long range simply means characters who have resources that are most effective on long angles. Mobile simply means characters who have resources that enable them to move around the map in short periods of time. Likewise, immobile simply means characters who do not have resources that enable them to move around the map in short periods of time. On the top left, there are close range and mobile characters. These characters specialize in moving quickly between different areas of the map as well as fighting at close range. Generally, these characters are good at dueling, but lack sustainability in terms of health and resources. Think of Tracer, Winston, and Lucio. On the bottom left, there are close range and immobile characters. These characters are unable to move around quickly, and they are most effective fighting at close range. Generally, these characters have lots of sustainability, but have difficulty dealing with ranged heroes. Think of Reaper, Reinhardt, and Brigitte. On the bottom right, there are long range and immobile characters. These characters are most effective fighting at long range and are unable to move around the map quickly. These characters tend to deal large amounts of burst damage, but are weak to mobile characters. Think of Widowmaker, Sigma, and Zenyatta. On the top right, there are long range and mobile characters. These characters are most effective at long ranges, as well as moving around the map quickly. There really is no true long range and mobile character, as that would be way too powerful. But some come close, like Pharah, Echo, and Soldier. To compensate for this inherent strength, the game either gives the characters slow projectile weapons, limits their damage capabilities, gives them a bigger character model, or a combination of them. A team composition is simply any assortment of 6 heroes, but whether a team comp is good or bad depends on the characters it is composed of. Characters in good team compositions make up for each other's weaknesses and amplify each other's strengths. Now, I want to show you the chart for the 3 fundamental team compositions. Does it look familiar? That's right, the team compositions directly correlate with the 4 different kinds of characters. Let's go a bit more in depth into these compositions. Dive is a composition whose components are mobile and close range. A dive team looks to engage all together at the same time on small areas of the map in short bursts, taking advantage of concentrated pressure to overwhelm the enemy. These engagements are called dives due to the quick and explosive nature of the action. Dives are an amplification of strength, because dive heroes are great at mobilizing into small areas. If they do it all together, then they have several times the effectiveness. However, dive heroes lack sustainability, so dive comps usually contain some other types of heroes, like Ana, who is long range and immobile, to make up for that weakness. Compositions defined in these categories are not strictly made up of those categories. It is just that, as a team as a whole, they work best at their range and their mobility. Brawl is a composition whose components are immobile and close range. Think of Brawl as a ball of death. A Brawl team looks to play very close together, allowing everyone to take advantage of AoE healing, combo short range abilities, and look out for one another. Brawl comps generally have enormous sustained healing and damage, although they are limited by range and vertical mobility. Brawl teams look to engage the enemy at close range by either letting the enemy come to them, or by taking routes to meet the enemy where they are stationed. This repositioning of the team and/or individual players is called rotating, which we will go over extensively later. Lucio is common in Brawl comps to make up for their lack of mobility with a speed boost. Poke Spam is a composition whose components are immobile and long range. Poke teams look to exert long range sustained pressure, always threatening to burst down a target in the blink of an eye. The term poke refers to how snipers, such as Ashe and Widowmaker, are able to annoyingly deal instantaneous damage from any range. Spam refers to how high damage projectile characters, such as Pharah and Junkrat, are able to exert enormous amounts of pressure by simply aiming in the enemy's direction. Notice that there is no long-range mobile composition. This is because that kind of composition would be way too strong, so the game is designed to make that impossible. As you can see, all 3 compositions are based on characters who play at similar ranges and mobility. On a side note, there's a 4th composition type called Hybrid. Hybrid is simply a composition that lies somewhere in between these compositions, such as Poke Dive or Double Bubble. There are also team compositions known as cheese comps. One example is the infamous pirate ship composition that revolves around the entire team supporting a bastion on the payload. I want to emphasize that it is not necessary to have a purely dive, brawl, or poke team. In fact, it is abnormal to find a completely dive or completely brawl or completely poke comp in your games. For example, a brawl team may have a Hanzo, which is a long-range immobile character. Despite his different character type, he can still be very impactful if he plays to his strengths. Because of his personal resources, he would most likely benefit the team more from not joining in on the ball of death and instead poking from range. You could say that this team is a brawl composition with slightly more poke capabilities, thanks to Hanzo. Remember that maps are simply space divided by cover. However, the length of angles, the amount of cover, the amount of flank routes, and the amount of high ground vary from map to map, which impacts how effective certain characters are. For example, a Reinhardt will struggle against high ground because he has no range and no mobility, meaning he can neither access the high ground nor pressure the enemy on it. However, a Winston, who has enormous amounts of mobility, can easily access the high ground and pressure whoever is on it. Close range and mobile characters, or dive characters, are most effective on maps with lots of cover, flank routes, short sightlines, and high ground, such as Gibraltar First Point. This is because their mobility allows them to access high ground, the abundance of cover and flanks will allow them to move around without being pressured from range, and the short sightlines will keep the enemy in range of their abilities. Close range and immobile characters, or brawl characters, are most effective on maps with lots of cover, short sightlines, and a lack of high ground, such as King's Row. Similarly to dive characters, the cover will allow them to close distance without being pressured, and the short sightlines will keep the enemy in range of their abilities. Unlike dive comps, however, immobile characters have trouble accessing high grounds, which is a very exploitable weakness. Long range and immobile characters, or poke characters, are most effective on maps with little cover, few flanks, long sightlines, and an abundance of high ground, such as Junkertown. The lack of cover keeps the enemy from hiding from damage, the long sightlines allow them to play at the most effective range, the few flanks limits dive and brawl characters from closing the distance, and the abundance of high ground forces dive and brawl characters to waste time and resources to pressure them. Synergies do not have to be based on range and mobility. These synergies usually function on a much smaller scale, although they can be greatly impactful. These kinds of synergies are vast, so I'll only go over some of the more prominent ones. Playstyle, ultimate, and ability combinations. A playstyle combination is a synergy where one character is able to support another character in their playstyle while being mutually benefited in some other way. It's basically mutualism from 9th grade biology. Pharmacy is one of many playstyle combinations. This is a combination of a Pharah and a Mercy. The Mercy, a support hero, boosts the effective health and damage of the Pharah, which allows the Pharah to exert incredible amounts of pressure. This kind of single-minded help from a support is known as pocketing. This combination is especially powerful because both characters are extremely mobile, both horizontally and vertically. Other such playstyle combos are Vayne Zarya and Ana Winston. An ultimate combination, or wombo combo, is a combination of ultimates, usually of 2. Nanoblade is one of many ultimate combinations. This combination is Ana's Nano Boost ultimate with Genji's Dragon Blade ultimate, which allows Genji to one-shot characters even through some support ultimates, as well as gives him more survivability. Other popular ultimate combos are Grav Dragon, Flux High Noon, and Bomb Shatter. Ability combinations are simply combinations of abilities. Ability combinations are generally more low-key than the other two kinds, which is perfectly natural. Pulled Pork is one of many ability combinations. Pulled Pork is a combination of a Versus Halt and Roadhog's Hook. This guarantees Roadhog to hit more hooks, increasing his effectiveness. There are several combos that go in between these, such as combining resources with ultimates, or resources with playstyle, or ultimates with playstyle. Okay, that was a lot of information. In short, characters who have similar, complementing, or compensating playstyles or synergical resources are able to work together to get more value than they would have individually. The best team compositions take advantage of both range and mobility similarities, as well as character-to-character synergies, in order to achieve the maximum possible value. What is value? Value is simply the result of trading resources. Think of value as an equation. Value of resources forced minus value of resources used. If the result is positive, then value is positive. If the result is negative, then value is negative. If the result is net zero, the value is 0. For example, let's say a Soldier 76 shoots an Ana and kills her. This soldier just traded his weapons resource, an easily rechargeable, low-value resource, for every one of Ana's resources, including her healing, biotic nade, sleep dart, nano boost, and hitbox. If we plug this into the equation, then it is quite obvious that the trade resulted in positive value for the soldier. Conversely, for the Ana, she traded all of her resources for the soldier's measly weapons resource. This resulted in negative value for her. There is so much nuance in which resources are more valuable than other resources that it would be impossible to learn even from a 10-hour PowerPoint speedrun. A good rule of thumb is that lives are worth more than ultimates, which are worth more than abilities, which are worth more than weapons. Some resources can be worth more or less on different parts of maps or with or against different characters, or even some characters' health are worth more at different times. Learning to get more value is how you improve. The more value you get, the more of a benefit you are to your team and the more games you will win. One important thing to remember in your future learning is opportunity cost. Just because your actions get positive value, it does not necessarily mean that your actions produce the maximum possible value you could have gotten. Time basically governs the game of Overwatch. It decides how quickly characters can move around the map, allowing differences in mobility to be impactful. It makes dying penalize the player with 10 seconds of uselessness. It decides how many tries the attackers get to capture the objective. It decides how often resources can be used via differing firing rates, charge up times, cooldowns, and ultimate charge. The most obvious consequence of time is that players need to be as efficient as possible. Or, in other words, players seek to get as much value within the time limit as possible. This is measured in actions per minute, widely known as uptime. An action is a simple 3-step process. You gather information, you make a decision based on this information and your general knowledge of the game, and then you carry out this decision. Actions result in a change of value. Many people in the community merge the awareness, decision-making, and game knowledge process into game sense, or the ability to adapt. Good players gather more information, make better decisions, and execute these decisions more effectively, ultimately resulting in more value. In short, good players are able to perform more high-value actions per minute. It is important to understand the obvious, that a greater quantity of actions does not equate to more value overall. I've seen many newer players simply perform more actions in order to increase their APM, which is absolutely idiotic. Several actions are made per minute, going through the game sense and mechanics process in a cyclical fashion. You'll notice that most time-related concepts tend to be cyclical. Summarizing what we have learned thus far, both teams are given resources in order to accomplish their goals divided among 3 roles. Tanks have resources to create and control safe space. DPS have resources to exert pressure, aka to create hostile space. Supports have resources to assist both of the other roles in their endeavors. However, teams must have angles to use these resources on. Thus, tanks must give their team the space they need to use their resources effectively. DPS and supports must use their resources on the angles branching off of the space provided by the tanks in order to use their resources effectively. All of this is done to win the objective. The attackers cannot simply walk on the objective to take it. The defenders have 2 ways to prevent the attackers from taking the objective. 1, they can contest the objective to prevent them from gaining any objective progress. 2, they can make the space on the objective hostile so that the attackers cannot occupy that space without dying. The attackers, in response, must also make the objective space as hostile as possible so that the defenders cannot contest, and they must make the space on the objective as safe as possible so they do not die from the defenders' pressure. This is quite simple. Teams, in order to control a space, will keep a space as safe as possible for their team and as unsafe as possible for the enemy. Taking space simply means for a team to move and occupy a space. Ultimately, the attacking team wants to take the space on the objective. Inversely, the defending team wants to prevent the attacking team from taking the space on the objective. Because both teams have opposing goals, they must fight in order to win the objective. A fight begins when the attacking team engages the defending team in order to take and control the space on the map that the defenders are controlling. Taking a space simply means for one team to push or clear another team from a space and then control that space. Another way to think about it is that one team will make a space so hostile that the controlling team has to back up or die, and then that first team is now able to control that space if they choose to. Before a fight begins, attackers get to choose what space they will fight for, or what space they will contest. A fight ends when one team disengages or dies, resulting in one team winning that contested space. However, despite the objective being the space that attackers ultimately want to control, it is rare for an initial fight to occur on the objective itself. Remember before that I mentioned that the objective is a tiny portion of a map as a whole, as well as that certain positions give inherent advantages, such as high ground. If the defenders only defend the objective itself, then the attackers will have free access to those valuable positions and will easily destroy the defenders. This is why the defenders usually choose to defend an area leading up to the objective, rather than defending directly on the objective. We will go over how map design naturally gives defenders a good place to defend later in the video, as well as what makes certain positions more valuable than others. For now, just realize that because defenders hold in places leading up to the objective, they have plenty of space to give up to the attackers in a fight, which means they will not immediately lose control of the objective if they lose a single fight. Inversely, the attackers do not want to barrel through straight to the objective. As stated before, there are valuable positions that the defenders would ideally be defending from that will make it nearly impossible for the attackers to win without first clearing them off of those positions. It would be like shooting fish in a barrel. Therefore, the attackers would ideally want to first clear the defenders off of their valuable positions, as well as set themselves up in those valuable positions before attacking the objective itself. In other words, the attackers must fight for space leading up to and around the objective before fighting for the objective itself. Again, we will go over why some positions are more valuable than others in part 7. Let's take a step back from where teams should fight, and let's look a little deeper into how teams win fights themselves. When a fight begins, the 2 teams will first match each other. This means that the amount of resources on both sides is equal, and the differences in value created are minimal. Sometime during this phase, one team will gain an advantage and push in. This advantage is called a trigger, which can be anything from a pick, a use of an ultimate, a resource advantage, a positional advantage, or several other things. Let's call the pushing team A team. When A team is pushing in, they are exerting pressure on the enemy, D team, that cannot be matched because D team is at a disadvantage of some sort. Now, the space that D team was previously controlling can no longer be kept safe due to limited resources and is thus turned into hostile space. If D team continues to stand in this hostile space, they, by definition, will die. Thus, they are forced to give up some of the space that they previously controlled and back up. This backing up is called kiting. A team will move forward to control the space that D team gave up. A team just took space. However, despite their disadvantage, D team is not in dire straits yet. They have simply given up some space, which means they have fewer angles to utilize and fewer areas to escape to. Inversely, A team does not quite have the fight in the bag yet. They simply have more angles to utilize and more areas to escape to. A team will look to press their positional advantage and take more space, and D team will look for their own trigger to spark a counter push against A team. Remember that triggers can be anything from picks or ultimates to resource or positional advantages. Because D team is at a disadvantage, finding this trigger becomes harder and riskier. Let's imagine D team manages to find their own trigger and begins their counter push against A team, retaking their lost space and pushing their advantage. This cycle of pushing and pulling is called Ebb and Flow, which continues until one team dies or disengages. There are a couple of very important things to understand about Ebb and Flow. First of all, Ebb and Flow is what makes ultimates so important. Ultimates are an easy trigger for pushes and counter pushes. If one team has 4 ultimates ready and the other has 2, it is obvious that the first team has a major advantage for the next fight because they can trigger a counter push twice more. Secondly, communication is vital to effectively follow Ebb and Flow. It is usually the tank's job to command their team to push or fall back, but healers are also great characters to do this because they can see everything that's going on. This kind of communication is called shot calling, or dynamic calls. Thirdly, players do not have to die in order for Ebb and Flow to occur. In fact, at high level play, it takes multiple pushes and pulls for even one person to die. It is simply the threat that the triggers present that allows teams to push in and forces teams to move back. Fourthly, it is important to note that taking space is very different from creating space. Tanks need to create safe space in order to give their team the necessary angles to create hostile space in the area they want to take or control. A Reinhardt creating safe space by walking forward with a shield will not, in and of itself, take space. Creating space is one of many means to an end, that end being taking a space. Lastly, remember that to take a space, a team needs to pressure the other team until they are forced to give up that space. Inversely, in order to control a space, a team needs to keep their own space as safe as possible for their own team and as hostile as possible for the enemy team. Remember that a tank's job is to create and control space. Thus, part of a tank's job to control space is also to make space as unsafe as possible for the enemy team. A win condition is a trigger that is planned before a fight to be the decisive trigger that ultimately wins the fight. Most of the time, win conditions are powerful ultimate combos, such as Grab Dragon. However, a Grab Dragon can be countered by many other resources such as Immortality Field, Transcendence, Sound Barrier, Diva's Defense Matrix, and more. These counters are the conditions that a team needs to clear in order to successfully pull off their fight-winning trigger. Thus, a team needs to identify how the enemy could counter their fight-winning trigger and make a plan to clear those conditions. For example, let's say that A team's win condition is Grab Dragon. D team has 2 ways to counter this: Immortality Field and Transcendence. A team will look to either pressure D team into wasting these specific resources, or to nullify the effect of these resources with other resources at their disposal. A team has a couple of options to clear the Transcendence condition. Tracer could try to shoot the Zenyatta, pressuring him into using Transcendence early to save his own life, or Ana could use Anti-Nade to nullify the effects of Transcendence. A team also has a couple of options to clear the Immortality Field condition. Tracer could again try to pressure the Baptiste into using it early. Inversely, D team could predict that A team's win condition is Grab Dragon, so they would try to counter the counters of the counters. And thus begins the game of chess. Tempo is the pace at which a team fights. You can think of it as the rate at which a team uses resources, or the rate at which teams push and pull. A team that plays at a fast tempo will use their resources quickly during engagements, while a team that plays at a slow tempo will use their resources slowly. When should a team play at a fast or slow tempo? This is where team compositions, value, and fights come together. The 3 primary team comps, Dive, Brawl, and Poke, all get differing amounts of value over time due to the nature of their heroes. The potential amount of value a character can get at any given time is called their power. Conveniently, the amount of power a character has over time cues us in on their tempo over time as well. Higher power at a given moment means to play at a higher tempo and vice versa. Dive heroes are very cyclical in nature. They quickly engage with their resources, get value, and disengage, then wait for their cooldowns to come back before re-engaging. Their kits tend to be ability based, with shorter cooldowns but weaker weapons. Think of Winston using his leap and bubble to engage and get a kill, before disengaging to wait for his leap and bubble to come off cooldown so that he can engage again. In a dive team composition, Winston will engage at the same time as his other teammates in order to maximize their power and effectiveness. As said earlier, dive engagements are very quick and explosive, giving them the name dive. Thus, dive comp's power over time would look something like this, which shows that dive comps play at a very slow tempo before a dive, and a very fast tempo during a dive, and again a very slow tempo after a dive. Poke spam heroes are not cyclical at all in nature. Their kits are weapons based with longer cooldowns. They are always playing at the same medium tempo during a fight, and rarely have to disengage to wait for cooldowns. Think of Junkrat constantly spamming, only pausing to reload. Thus, Poke comp's power over time will look something like this, which shows that Poke comps play at a constant tempo over the course of a fight. The longer that a fight goes on, the more of an advantage Poke will have over the other team comps. Brawl heroes are somewhere in between. Their kits are between weapon and ability based. They are somewhat cyclical, with medium abilities and weapons, and long cooldowns. They have a lot of power at the beginning of a fight, but it dwindles over time. Think of Reinhardt's shield that wears down over time, allowing it to be strong at the beginning of a fight, but weak towards the end. Thus, Brawl comp's power over time would look something like this, which shows that Brawl comps start out at a fast tempo that slows down over time. As you can see, the tempo that a team should play at depends on the type of heroes in the team. With these charts stacked on top of each other, we can reveal something about the balance of the team comps. Brawl is most powerful at the beginning of a fight and wears down over time, so they will try to end the fight as quickly as possible. Dive is super powerful during a dive, but they are weak before and after dives. Poke is always at the same power no matter how long the fight goes on, so they will try to drag on the fight as long as possible against Brawl and Dive. In between pushes and pulls, teams will stabilize. Stabilization consists of repositioning, coordinating, and recharging resources, often behind cover for a couple of seconds. This is done so that the pushing team can make the most of their advantage. For example, let's say a team is running low on health and resources as a team. The allied Hanzo manages to land a clutch headshot on an enemy, which is a trigger. Instead of rushing into the defending team immediately, the attackers play behind cover for a couple of seconds to heal up and recharge some abilities, such as Reinhardt's shield. If they did not do this, the team would be low health with no cooldowns, essentially giving the enemy a free opportunity to make up their disadvantage and turn the tables. During this period, the team should communicate that they are stabilizing, so that no one rushes in alone after witnessing the pick. Only after they stabilize would the attackers push their advantage. Another reason stabilization is powerful is that it prevents the enemy from trading. Trading is where one team gets a pick and, immediately or shortly after, the other team gets a pick as well. This would balance out the advantages and disable either team from pushing in. A fast tempo is often confused for aggressiveness, and a slow tempo is often confused for passiveness. This is a mistake. A fast tempo simply means using resources quickly, and a slow tempo simply means using resources slowly. When a team plays at the appropriate tempo, whether fast or slow, they are playing in the most effective or powerful way possible. This is similar to the concept in microeconomics, where selling goods at a higher price does not necessarily bring greater profit, nor does selling goods at a lower price bring less profit. There is a point of equilibrium where potential profit is maximized. Applying this to Overwatch, a faster tempo does not necessarily mean more power, nor does a slower tempo mean less power. There is a point of equilibrium that you must find where potential value, power, is maximized, and then play at the corresponding tempo. In truth, aggression is the measure of risk. Playing aggressively means to play at a high risk for a high reward, and playing passively means to play at a low risk for low reward. Aggression and passivity are not bad. There are times for both. For example, when a team is stabilizing, they play passively to limit risk so that they can recharge health and resources as quickly as possible without worrying about the enemy counter-pushing. On the other hand, when a team is searching for a trigger for a counter-push, sometimes a team will play more aggressively, increasing risk to, let's say, get a pick and turn the tide. One thing that should go without saying is that teams need to begin a fight together at the same time and need to match their tempo. This means that in between fights, teams should not engage the enemy, even if it means doing literally nothing at all and standing still until all 6 players have respawned and grouped up. If even a single person is missing, then a sixth of the potential power of a team will drop, and the enemy will have an advantage equivalent to a pick trigger. Waiting 10 seconds for a teammate to respawn is better than wasting 30 seconds fighting a losing battle. Another way to say time in engagements is matching tempo. When teams as a whole engage together and match their tempo, like in the chart, then their team-wide power goes higher. If individual players try to play at their own tempo, then they are subtracting from their team's overall power, even if they increase it slightly later. In practice, individuals need to time their own individual pushes and pulls with the teams in order to get the highest value possible. For example, Tracer should wait until her team is engaging the enemy before attacking the enemy supports from behind. This way, when the enemy supports are pressured into using resources to protect themselves, it will take those resources away from the rest of their teammates who are being pressured on the front line, which is double the value. This concept is often termed sinking pressure. You just learned a lot about Overwatch. Hopefully, this gave you a new perspective on the game, and I hope you appreciate it as much as I do. However, this is only Overwatch 101. I plan to create an Overwatch 102 as soon as I get the time. In fact, the first draft of the script is already ready. It includes positioning and map design, as promised, as well as some advanced space and time concepts, like kill boxes that even include a touch of calculus. How exciting! However, I may not finish it for a while. This video, as someone who basically learned intermediate editing for the sole purpose of making this video, took months to finish. I'll try to get it out before the end of the year, so put on notifications so you remember to check back here.